When the president's son vanished without a trace, the headlines screamed. But what no one knew was that Barron wasn't lost. He was finally listening. It wasn't planned. Not by his security team, not by the press office, and certainly not by the family bearing the name Trump. But early that morning, without cameras, without advisors, without a phone, Barron Trump disappeared. At 22, he carried a name too heavy for one person and a silence that stretched even louder than the voices trying to define him. He was scheduled to appear at a youth leadership forum in D.C., a carefully crafted stop in a quiet campaign to reintroduce him to America, but he never arrived. At first, the Secret Service assumed it was a mix-up. Wrong route, changed detail. But as the minutes turned to hours, their tone shifted from confused to alert. They searched the car, checked hotel surveillance, scanned his location history. Nothing. In his suite, the bed was made, the lamp turned off, and a single note sat beside a half-empty glass of water. Scrawled in block letters, only 6 words. I need to know what's real. The media caught on by mid-morning. Barron Trump missing. White House silent. Has the president's son vanished? But Barron hadn't vanished. He had simply stepped off the map. The air in southeast D.C. that morning was thick with late spring stillness, humid, quiet, almost suspicious in its calm. Barron didn't know where he was going, only where he wasn't. He wore a black hoodie pulled low, sunglasses, and a baseball cap, anonymous in the kind of neighborhood no one expected him to walk through. His steps were slow, not cautious, just unsure, like someone who had always walked with others and was suddenly walking alone. Eventually, he found himself in a crumbling park, half benches, half overgrown sidewalk, and the faint smell of gasoline in the breeze. And there he saw him, an old man in a faded army jacket slouched on a bench like he belonged to the wood itself. A beard gone white from more than age. A face that had seen too much and still asked for nothing. Barron sat 3 feet away. The man didn't look at him, didn't ask for anything, didn't move. They sat in silence. 2 names heavy in different ways. One carried the weight of a family empire. The other had long since been forgotten by the world that once needed him. Minutes passed. Then, without turning his head, the man spoke. People only see you when they need to forget themselves. Barron didn't answer, but the words hit like a quiet truth. Heavy, familiar. You don't talk much, the man said after a while. Barron shook his head. Good, the man replied. We already have enough people trying to be heard, not enough trying to understand. When Barron finally stood to leave, the old man, Hank, he would later learn, did something unexpected. He reached into the side pocket of a tattered backpack, the kind with broken zippers and stitched seams, and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. Don't read it now, he said, eyes still on the cracked pavement. Read it when you can't sleep. Barron hesitated, then took it. The paper felt thin, almost transparent with age, but the way Hank handed it over made it feel like stone. You look like someone who's never been told the truth, Hank added, then closed his eyes and leaned back against the sun-stained bench. Barron stood there for a moment. No reply, no goodbye, just the letter in his hand and a strange ache rising in his chest. He walked away without looking back. But something about Hank's stillness stayed with him, not the kind that comes from being tired, the kind that comes from seeing the world too clearly and deciding not to argue with it anymore. By now, the media had entered full chaos mode. Barron Trump disappearance reaches day 1. Sources claim Barron abandoned security team. Mental health concerns spark urgent conversations. Helicopters scanned rooftops. Drones hovered over bridges. Commentators speculated on every motive from rebellion to breakdown. But Barron wasn't hiding. He was just listening. That evening, as D.C. slipped into golden dusk, he wandered into a small church tucked between a shuttered pawn shop and a failing bodega. No cameras, no choir, just pews and dust, and a preacher rehearsing in an empty sanctuary. Barron sat in the back, didn't kneel, didn't speak, just sat, watching light filter through stained glass like silence had color. At one point, a woman passed him in the aisle, stopped, and placed something in his palm, a sticky note, one sentence. "It's okay not to know who you are yet." That night, in a motel room off a forgotten stretch of highway, Barron lay on a thin mattress in the dark. The letter still sat on the nightstand. He stared at it for a long time, not afraid of what it might say, afraid of what it might reveal. And when he finally unfolded it, his hands were trembling. It began like a whisper, not the kind that begged attention, but the kind that felt like it had been waiting for years, folded between the lines of a life lived in silence. Barron read the first line slowly. "To the one who finds this, I don't know your name. I don't need to. All I need to know is that you are still searching. That's enough." He blinked, took a breath, continued. "I once believed being forgotten was the worst thing that could happen to a man. Now I know it's being remembered for the wrong things." Each word landed like it was made of brick and dust, not elegant, not poetic, just real. The letter told the story of a man who had fought in Fallujah, who held dying soldiers in his arms, who came home to a country that clapped at parades but looked away at stoplights. People love the idea of sacrifice, the letter read, but not the mess it leaves behind. Barron paused. The world had always told him who he was, told him what to wear, what to say, what not to feel. But here was a man who had lost everything, and had written not in bitterness, but in truth. "The loudest men I ever met were the ones most afraid of being quiet. Don't be like them." By the end of the letter, Barron was no longer reading. He was absorbing, remembering moments he'd pushed down, words he never said. He didn't sleep that night. He wrote, not a post, not a speech, just thoughts. On a napkin, on a receipt, on the back of a motel pamphlet. Something had cracked open, and he wasn't sure he wanted it to close. When Barron walked through the doors of the VA Center at 6:13 a.m., the staff didn't recognize him. No motorcade, no badge, no photographers, just a tall young man in a wrinkled shirt asking, "Mind if I sit with a few people?" They were skeptical at first, then curious. He sat beside a retired Navy nurse who hadn't spoken to her daughter in 8 years, next to a Korean War vet who had lost 2 toes and 3 brothers, in front of a woman who still wore her husband's dog tags around her wrist like a charm bracelet. He didn't talk much, he listened. Every story was a river, some calm, some rushing. And Barron let himself float. One man cried, another laughed so hard he spilled his applesauce. Barron didn't flinch, didn't correct, didn't perform. And when his Secret Service detail finally found him, hours later, he stood, nodded politely, and said, "I'm ready to go now." The press conference was packed, every chair filled, every mic live. They were expecting a performance, a spin, a soundbite. What they got instead was silence. Barron stood at the podium, hands at his sides, eyes steady. Then he said, "I was looking for something my name couldn't buy." And that was it. Reporters shouted questions, cameras zoomed in, speculation swirled, mental breakdown, crisis of identity, silent protest. Barron didn't answer, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He walked away like the words had said enough. And maybe, for the first time, they had. The letter had stayed in his jacket pocket until he was alone with his father. Donald Trump sat in the East Wing library, tie loosened, Fox News muted, an untouched Diet Coke beside him. Barron entered, sat down across from him, and placed the letter on the table. He didn't explain, just read, word by word, page by page. When he finished, there was no applause, no commentary, just stillness. Then the former president spoke. "That's the first time someone said something to me without wanting something back." It wasn't praise. It wasn't reflection. It was something rarer. Honesty. Barron leaned back. For the first time in his life, he saw his father not as a figure, but as a man. Not invincible, not immovable, just human. And in that silence between them, something true passed through the air, unspoken, but undeniable. They called it a publicity stunt. They said it was calculated, strategic, maybe even rehearsed. But no one saw the rooms. Not yet. Barron didn't hold a press conference, didn't post a reel, didn't send a tweet. Instead, quietly, without fanfare, he began the work. In a handwritten note sent to every major public school district and VA hospital in the country, Barron introduced the idea. A stillness room. Just one. No screens, no agenda. Just chairs, light and time. A space where no one performs, no one persuades. A space to be, not to do. Most administrators ignored it, but one didn't. Then 2, then 10. Within a month, 25 stillness rooms had been created. Simple spaces, soft-lit corners of hospitals and schools where the world slowed down. People didn't understand it, but they felt it. A veteran who hadn't spoken in 3 years whispered his wife's name inside one. A teenager left a note that read, "This is the first time I haven't felt like a problem." There were no signs, no slogans, just space. And everywhere he went, Barron carried Hank's letter with him. Folded, faded, but never forgotten. It was a gray Thursday morning when Barron returned to the park. The bench was still there. The cracks in the pavement still looked like veins of a forgotten city. But Hank wasn't. A city worker in an orange vest noticed him standing still and said, "You looking for the old guy, sat here every day?" Barron nodded. The worker paused, then pulled a small envelope from his back pocket. Said if a tall kid came back asking, I should give him this. Didn't say who you were, but I figured. Barron opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, Hank in uniform smiling beside a tank, and a note scrawled on the back. "If you ever lead, lead the ones no one sees." He stared at the photo for a long time, then tucked it into his black journal. He didn't cry. He just whispered, "Thank you," and walked away. He didn't campaign. He didn't run. But in one silent walk through a forgotten part of the city, Barron Trump stepped into something larger than politics. And when he looked back, the noise had finally gone quiet. If this story moved you, share it. Not for likes, not for clicks, but for someone out there who's been waiting to feel seen. Leave a comment with just one word: stillness. And if you've ever met your own version of Hank, tell us what they taught you. Because sometimes the quietest voices leave the loudest echoes.